Good afternoon. It's great to see everyone and start a new month of Lunch and Learn on a fantastic, wide-ranging topic that starts with one rabbi's family story. Our Lunch and Learn this month is entitled Doorway to Heroism and the Holocaust, One Man, Two Countries, and Three Heroic Actions. This is with Rabbi Jack Romberg. Jack Romberg is Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Israel in Tallahassee. Rabbi Jack Romberg's great uncle, a German Jew, was a decorated soldier in World War I, part of the resistance in Cologne, and at the start of Hitler's reign of terror. He ultimately became a Silver Star decorated U.S. Army soldier. Rabbi Romberg over this month will take us on a journey from 1812 through the lens of the Holocaust via his uncle Richard Stern's actions. And this class is based on Rabbi Romberg's book, A Doorway to Heroism. I have a funeral to attend, so Cantor Jake Harris, it will be with you for the class today, but just wanted to be here to welcome Rabbi Romberg virtually to Temple Bethel. Go ahead. So Rabbi, if you can unmute.
Can you hear me now? Okay, well, thank you for having me come to do the teaching about German Jewish history. And while, of course, the book that I wrote contains a lot of the German Jewish history that I studied, there is a lot more that I'm actually going to teach about. And where I'm going to begin is actually around 1800 and maybe a little bit before. And then we'll go up to 1812. Today, we're going to go through the 19th century and talk about German Jewish history through the 19th century. And then the second session will go into the 20th century. And I have some special things for the third one, which is going to, of course, also include Kristallnacht. So what I want to begin with is to tell you that Germany was not a united nation of all of its states. There were about 25 states in 1800, and they were each independent. Of course, the largest and the most powerful was Prussia. Now, the picture that I have up here is to show you somebody that I think everybody has heard of. And this is, of course, Moses Mendelssohn. Now, I'm not going to be talking about Moses Mendelssohn as somebody who helped to start Reform Judaism, but what I'm going to do is put him in the perspective of what was going on in German Jewish history. So, in the Middle Age years of Germany, Jews were forbidden to farm, to own their own houses, to trade in large group of items. They could not learn crafts or professions except for medicine. In Prussia, Jews could only live in certain and mostly larger cities. There were some smaller towns they were allowed to live in, but they were not allowed to live in a lot of places. And of course, they were not allowed to interact everyday life with Christian Germans. And Nuremberg is an example of a larger city that Jews were not allowed to live in. And in fact, of course, there were places, a lot of cities and towns where they were allowed, that in a lot of those places, it had to be in a ghetto. So they were stuck in ghettos in a number of places. Now, in the 18th century, which is where we're sort of beginning, Hamburg had the largest Jewish population in Germany, about 8,000 Jews, and that was about 6% of Hamburg's population. Now, Berlin, which of course is possibly the most famous German city, it was very limited. There were very, very few Jews that were allowed to be in Berlin, and were only allowed to go into Berlin in the 18th century if they were very rich or if they were a scholar, and the gatekeeper would register the incoming Jews. So here is the example that applies to Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn entered Berlin in 1743. He became the first German Jew to achieve any prominence. He loved and praised German culture and civilization, which became the beginning of many Jews starting to do the same. He began the building of a large percent of Jews in Germany, and they started feeling deep about being German and Jewish. He developed social life with some leading non-Jewish intellectuals, and that was very new for any Jew, is to connect with non-Jewish intellectuals. And so he did that, and one of them was Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, a popular writer, and he was the first one to write about Jews, that Jews possessed a virtue like other humans. So that was a new perspective given by any Christian at that point in the latter part of the 18th century. Later on, Mendelssohn was given protected status by the king, but it was not given to his wife and children. Now, that was Frederick Williams, 1786 to 1797, was the successor to Frederick II. He rejected a requested change that would have initiated a number of things for Jews in the 1790s, and only 21 prominent Jewish businessmen were given Prussian citizenship. That's for the entire state of Prussia. Only 21 in the late 18th century were actually given Prussian citizenship. And the Prussian treated Jews, actually, even with those limitations, Prussia actually treated Jews better than any of the other German states. So in general, at the beginning of the 19th century, Jews were not allowed to own any real estate. Conversion to Judaism was illegal at 1800. And there were no intermarriages that were legal or allowed before 1860. So we're going to take a look at everything, a lot of the things that happened from 1800 to 1860. Now, of course, in the early 1800s, Napoleon had an effect on Jews in Germany, in the different states. When he beat Prussia in October of 1806, the Jews who remained expected to be given full civil rights, but the king, Frederick Williams III, now did not give the Jews full civil rights. Some of the medieval guilds were abolished, and 2 years after the defeat of the richest Jews in Berlin, two years after the defeat, the richest Jews in Berlin were given more equality, but not necessarily full citizenship. Only the wealthy minority benefited. And this was because not that Napoleon was running Prussia, but had conquered it enough and had forced Prussia to become one of its allies. So Prussia then had been an ally to France, but turned against France after 1806, but lost to them and was forced to become an ally of France, like I said. A number of the other German states were fully annexed by France, and the Jews living in those German states were emancipated, giving them full political rights. So, as I said, Napoleon controlled a bunch of things in a number of the German states, especially the ones that he actually took over. And as a matter of fact, a lot of Jewish families in Germany had either pictures of Napoleon because they actually liked him, or they had a little statue of Napoleon, like maybe of his head. And in fact, my dad and his family had one of those in their house that they lived in Cologne, Germany, even in the 1820s, 1830s. They had they had this little statue of Napoleon's head. Okay, now we go into the emancipation of Jews in Prussia, and that's in 1812. In 1812, France lost to Russia, and Prussia left its alliance to France. Prussia had the most Jewish population of all of Germany, and in 1812, that newer king, Frederick William III, finally approved an edict to emancipate the Jews, which technically ended most of their restrictions and made them legally full citizens. Jews began to show, excuse me, I have to show a difference here, sorry. Okay, that is Frederick Wilhelm III. That's the king of Prussia who actually did emancipation for the Jewish people in Prussia. Okay, now Jews began to do something that Jews would do all through the 19th century and all through the first few decades of the 20th century, and that is they would volunteer for the Prussian army. They wanted to show their patriotism by doing that kind of volunteer. And that played a key role in the Battle of Waterloo, the final win over Napoleon in 1815. 1,300 Prussian Jews served in the army. 71 actually won an Iron Cross. Despite Jews showing their patriotism to Prussia, their emancipation was not popular among the German Christians. Jews were legally allowed to move out of the cities in which they had been limited to live in. Now, that's an important part. As I said earlier, Jews were limited in terms of they had to be in ghettos, they had to be in certain cities, and a few smaller towns they were allowed to be in. But there were so many places they were just not allowed to live. But one example is being allowed in Nuremberg in 1839. And this included going to also, like I said, they also could go to smaller towns and they could get their own property. They were finally allowed to buy property and have their own places. And I have two relatives from two parts of my family, one from the Romberg part and one from the Stern part, that I'm going to show their background that actually shows what they were allowed to do. So the first one, okay, the first one is, and this is a house that was built back in the late 18th century, okay? Now, the person who would be my great, 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 great grandpa, his original name was Nathan Moses. And he later, after he would settle in his town and get going, he actually in the 1830s changed his name to Nathan Romberg. Why did he change it to Nathan Romberg? Because Romberg was a person by the name of Romberg was actually a very famous cello musician in Germany. And so he decided he would take the last name of a very famous musician person. And all of my Romberg family that I know of, that I've learned about, and I started to learn about them in actually 2012, and I interviewed so many of the survivors in 2013, and everybody in my family loves classical music, at least on the Romberg side. Okay, so Nathan Romberg was born in 1793 in Petershagen, Prussia. In 1815, he started his own fabric store. At age 30, in 1823, he moved to Lengerich, a town that Jews had not been allowed in for their whole time until 1812's emancipation. In the 1830s, like I said, he changed his name. His first marriage was in 1817 to a woman 3 years younger than him, and they had 6 children together. However, she died from a disease, and then he married Julie Julie Hyman Itzeg, who was 20 years younger than him. She had 5 children with him. He helped finance the synagogue built in Lengerich, and he owned a Torah that shows that he was very committed to reading Torah, to studying Torah and so forth, because he's the one who owned his own Torah, and he helped, like I said, put together the synagogue in Lengerich. So there had never been Jews in Lengerich, but there were Jews moving to Lengerich. Okay, now this is the house that he ended up living in, and I actually took this picture in 2012. Okay, and I also took this picture, which shows the history of the house. You can see that it was built just before 1788, and of course Nathan Moses, who then became Nathan Romberg, moved in 1823. Okay, now that's me standing in the funeral at the tomb of Nathan Romberg, and that was taken in 2012. And I have to tell you that look at how untaken care of this funeral, this cemetery is, and it was just really interesting to be in there. You had to get a special key to even get into the cemetery, and the tombs ran from about the 1840s or so, and the last tomb that I saw was in 1938. Was marked for 1938. So that was that. Okay. Now, the son who was Nathan Romberg's primary heir was Julius Romberg. That's him. Okay. And he was born in 1831, and he married Frederica in 1851, who had moved to and settled in Diepholz. That's a different town. And when Julius Romberg went and moved to Diepholz in the 1850s, they also were a town that had not allowed Jews until sometime in the 19th century. And he also helped to set up the synagogue there. And he petitioned the congregation back in Lengerich to actually get the Torah that had belonged to his dad and take it to the synagogue that he was putting together in Diepholz. Well, the congregation in Lengerich sued him, and the whole thing went to a court in Germany about whether or not he would be allowed to take the Torah from the synagogue in Lengerich and take it to Diepholz. Well, the court ruled that since it was his family's Torah, he was allowed to take it to Diepholz. And by the way, I learned a lot about this because of doing research in Diepholz in the summer of 2013. Okay, this is actually something put together by another great grandpa, and that would be Seligman Stern, which is actually on my dad's mother's side. See, my dad's father, his biological father, was Walter Romberg. My dad was born in 1923. His mom was originally Martha Stern. Now, Martha Stern's brother is Richard Stern, who I wrote the book about. Okay, and Richard Stern's great-great-grandpa was Seligman Stern. Seligman Stern was born also in 1793 in Harburg, Bavaria, and he served in the Prussian army for a year in 1818. He then lived in Remagen from 1819 to 1821, and after a year in Badorf, he moved to Weilerswist, which is part of a group of small towns. But the two key towns that he did work in and was part of Weilerswist and Freischheim. And that, of course, is in Prussia. His first work when he moved to that area, and again, because Jews were just starting to move into these towns, into this set of towns, he was a teacher. And he taught not only things about Judaism to the children that were moving into that area, but he also taught, regular subjects like, history and, and math and so forth. So he was a Jewish teacher, both of Jewish things and both of the things that the kids just needed to learn. Okay. In 1822, he met Regina Human in Freischheim, and he married her in 1824. He not only taught, but he also worked as a servant for Regina's parents, for the family. He lived there, that is in Freischheim, for the rest of his life. And hold on, okay. All right, he lived there for the rest of his life, and he was well treated by the town and by the town and county leaders. The mayor of Freischheim wrote a lot of letters to keep people running things in Prussia to get Seligman Stern actual citizenship. So here's an example of some German Christians in certain areas that actually were trying to help the Jews a lot. So it was not only the mayor of Freischheim, but also the leader of the county of that area that tried to help Seligman get his citizenship, so that not only could he vote in that area or do certain things in that area, but also that he could be the official owner of a business that he wanted to put together. Okay. And he ended up leading the Jewish community in Freischheim and Weilerswist. And in fact, this is the blueprint of what he put together, what he designed, which is not only his house, but the synagogue that was built in Freischheim. And there's the synagogue that he built in Freischheim. And he arranged this. And again, this was done in the late 1840s. And so this is an example of how Jews, these are two examples actually, of how Jews were not allowed to do certain things, up until 1812 when the emancipation happened. But I've given you now two examples from my own family of exactly how Jews could start to do things by living in new areas and setting up independent Jewish communities and new synagogues and so forth. And that was all very, very new. Okay, so before I continue on, I just want to ask if anybody has a question that they would like to ask at this point. Okay, if not, then I'm going to continue on. All right. Well, I'll tell about who this is. Actually, I'm going to go back and you can watch the synagogue for a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to go into Jewish life through the 19th century. And there's an interesting parallel between German Jewish life through, from the time of their emancipation and African American life from the time of their emancipation in the Civil War. And that is, for Jews, there were times when their lives were moving up. And I just gave you two examples of, from my family, of their lives moving up. And there are also examples of lives that were brought down and things that were done to Jews that were awful. And that's the same thing that happened to African Americans in the United States. So we're going to go into Jewish life and anti-Semitism through the 19th century. So don't think that anti-Semitism was just redone in the 20th century when the Nazis took power. It actually kept going through the 19th century. So in 1819, there were a series of riots in Bavarian cities and towns that were demolishing Jewish that were demolishing Jewish homes and stores. There was screaming, "Death to all Jews," in these riots, okay? Outside of Prussia, 90% of German Jews were poor, but there were no riots in Prussia. Prussia actually taught Jews better, not perfectly, but they taught Jews a lot better than the other states that existed in the German area. And by the way, as we get into the middle of the 19th century, there were then about 39 German states throughout the German area. At the time of the riots, Germany had, at this time, they had 36 states. Okay. Then all the states were independent. The status of Jews varied among them, with some states abrogating emancipation from the Napoleon era. And so some states, then a lot of the states ended any of the emancipation. And some states prohibited Jews from posts in public offices. They prohibited from the army. They prohibited from teaching in schools or universities. A lot of the states actually wanted Jews back into their medieval status, which is what I described before. So the hatred of Jews in the early part of the century was mostly against, actually, in the 1820s and 30s, most of the hatred against Jews were against those who were assimilated into German society and against middle-class Jews and, of course, richer Jews. And those who converted, there was a lot of hatred against Jews who bothered to convert to Christianity. So this can be connected to the suppression of Jews who converted to when the church created the Inquisition that criticized many of the converts of still being Jewish. And that was a typical thing. So it's like back in Spain in the 14th and 15th century, the Catholic Church did a lot of conversion of Jews into Catholicism, and yet a lot of those Jews, even those that didn't secretly still perform Judaism, even those that just became Catholic, were still considered to be really Jewish and not really being Catholic. And the same thing was being done to Jews who converted in Germany in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. In the 19th century, Germany, there was less hatred of Jews who were actually Orthodox or doing traditional Jewish things. There was less hatred of them than those who were either assimilating into German society or had converted into German Christianity. The King of Prussia, at the time around 1820, was against Reform Judaism. And I'm not going into the history of Reform Judaism, but you should know that, of course, Moses Mendelssohn, he was the beginner of the happening of Reform Judaism. The early 19th century is when a number of Jews started to really put together synagogues and so forth for that would be the Reform Judaism. But like I said, the King of Prussia was against Reform Judaism in 1820, and he felt that it kept Jews from actually converting to Christianity. That was the feeling of the King of Prussia in 1820. As the 19th century moved on, there were revolutions in places in Europe, including German states, to put an end to despotism and inequalities in the laws. There was also pushing for freedom of press and general elections to a democratic parliament for all of Germany. Jews were urged by leaders of the ones who were trying to get a democratic parliament going and getting freedom press and so forth. There were leaders of those political parties that were urging Jews to support all this because it would help them. In 1848, a large number of assimilated Jews joined other Germans in political parties who advocated for a democratic republic. Also, there were German rulers in many states that appointed liberal ministers to placate the rebels by discussing general elections. The groups doing the discussion included 5 German Jews and 4 recently converted Jews. So it's interesting that in the liberal group of politicians that there were definitely Jews part of this, and definitely converted Jews part of this. As this unfolded in 1848, half of the Jewish population practiced traditional rituals, and most were conservative. The other half were more German, and most were liberal or leftist liberal. The average age of conservative Jews was 57.6, and the average age of Jewish democratic militants was 31.9. So this was the first time in German history in which Jews got active in politics and street actions, with, of course, both conservative Jews and liberal Jews doing it. It's just interesting the different ages that both groups included. So there was a national parliament. There was a national parliament that was actually created in Germany, but it was just a phantom. It was just a phantom because German states were not really united as a country. The states, all 36, and then again, after another couple of decades, it was up to 39. All those states were independent. But this kind of national phantom, national parliament, it had 300 delegates, and 9 of the delegates were Jewish, plus 7 of those delegates were Jews who had converted soon to Christianity. And this parliament took place and met in Frankfurt. In 1849, it actually started to fade away because the Prussian king hated it, and he wouldn't allow this to keep going. So even though the revolution to create a republic failed, it actually strengthened the feelings in a lot of the Jews that they were really becoming Germans. And the revolution greatly increased the number of Jews that were leaning towards the liberal parties that were trying to get something more political, more democratic, a more democratic Republican going in Germany. Okay, now we go to this. So let me ask, how many of you know who this person is? Do you know who he is? Anybody know who he is? He's a very, very famous person in German history. Okay, this is Otto von Bismarck. Have you heard of Otto von Bismarck?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. Good. Okay. So in 1861, Otto von Bismarck was appointed to be the Prime Minister of Prussia. And that was by the new King of Prussia, William I. And Bismarck was a member of the National Liberal Party. And one of the leaders of that party was the son of a very observant Jew. And there was a formal emancipation of the Jews done when Bismarck became the prime minister. Jews hoped that this formal act would end up in real equality, because even though there was an emancipation in 1812, and this, yes, they had been able to do things that Jews were never able to do before, that still doesn't make equality. It wasn't Jews equal to Christians in Germany. So the Jewish people hoped that this act done when Bismarck became the prime minister, that Jews would become equal. So Jewish participation in German politics started to rise again in the 1860s.
Oh, people?
I'm sorry, what? What was that? Oh, okay. Okay. In August of 1870, I'm sure a lot of you know that a war broke out between France and Prussia, which of course Prussia won rather quickly. Jews did a lot to support the Bismarck lead in Prussia, and a key banker who helped to finance and advise, for example, that was one of the Jewish supporters, was a very important banker, who ran a bank, who provided finance. Advisors who knew of info on France, they worked with Bismarck, and a large number of Jews in Prussia became soldiers. 4,700 or so Jewish men became combat soldiers. 140 of them were officers in 1870 in this war. 483 were, there were 483 casualties, and 373 were winners of the Iron Cross. Despite all of this, Bismarck would actually at sometimes denigrate Jews. And yes, he did things to make them, to give them more equality, but he also did some speaking and things to denigrate Jews, which of course was not good. Now, the official unification of German states happened in January 18th of 1871. And that was, of course, after the end of the Prussian and Franco War. Now, the unification of the country had been pushed to happen for a number of years, and nationalism in Germany was about a unified country. So we can define nationalism in different ways, but back in leading up to 1871, the word nationalism in Germany, or the idea of nationalism in Germany, was all about getting all of those 39 independent states united into one country, the First Reich of Germany. Okay, so after the unification, nationalism actually changed. It became, quote, and I'm taking a quote from somebody's book, nationalism became conservative, xenophobic, conformist, and worshipful of the militarists who made the win over France happen. And like I said, that's from a book called The Pity of It All. Okay. Then, okay. At the beginning of the 19th century, 70% of the Jews had marginal, insecure lives. By 1870, especially in Prussia, that was down to just 5% having insecure lives. That's a huge change. 70% of Jews having insecure lives, down to 5% Jews having insecure lives. In 1871, an emancipation law for the whole new Reich, okay, since it was now a united country, okay? So there was an emancipation law passed, they're done in 1871, and it abolished all civil and political restrictions based on religious differences. With the increase of assimilation, the number of conversions dropped sharply. That meant that Jews felt they did not have to convert to Christianity to actually be Germans. With the pass of this particular law in 1871, that was putting out and saying that there should be, no conversion, no mistreatment of people just because of whatever religion they were at. So in 1874, a law then allowed, for the first time in Jewish history in Germany, in 1874, a law allowed mixed civil marriages for the first time. And between 1871 to 1878, 36 Jews were elected to the Reichstag. That's the parliament. So two important things. And these would really hit a lot from 1871, 1874 onward. And that was number one, of course, that Jews could be elected to the Reichstag, okay? And number two would be that actually Jews could intermarriage with non-Jews. So very, very interesting things that ended up taking a large point for Jews. Okay, now all right, this is from 1877, and you can see that that's a caricature of a Jew. Okay, so even though, can everybody hear me okay? Because something just came up on mine. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. So this obviously shows that there was something that happened despite the passing of the changing, of giving equality, at least technically giving equality to Jews and equality to other people, the passing of that law, there was still something being done or thought about Jews. This is an example of a caricature of people who hated Jews for some reason. And actually, anti-Semitism got huge again for a while, starting in October of 1873. And hold on just a minute. Okay. Of 1873. What happened in October of 1873 was a stock market crash in Germany that caused tens of thousands of German families to lose everything that they had, all of their money, all of what they owned. And all of a sudden, Jews were blamed by many Germans for the crash and the resulting economic difficulty. And here is the caricature from 1873. There were a lot of Jewish stockbrokers because it was one of the jobs that decades earlier that Jews had been limited to do. Jews had been limited with certain jobs in the early 19th century and just slightly before the 19th century. One of the jobs they were limited to do were things things in financial jobs. And that's why some Jews were so big in the banks and also why a large number of Jews were involved in stock market. And by the way, if you know the history of Jews going back into the mid-century, into the Middle Ages, medieval ages, back all over Europe, you know that, for example, even in England, Jews were allowed very, very few things. Medication was one, being a doctor was one, and doing finances was another limitation. So that's why there were so many Jewish stockbrokers. All right. So anti-Semitic Germans said that capitalism was Jewish, was a Jewish wrongness. Okay, that capitalism was something being done by the Jews to completely mess up things in Germany. Now, interesting that free enterprise and capitalism would be taken by a group of people and blamed on Jews, but of course it was done that way because of the drop of the stock market and this chunk of people that, despite the laws passed, were determined to stay against the Jewish people. Okay. So these people said that Jews were creating a materialistic society that consumed the life savings of good Christians. And that's how they got a lot of Christians to go against the Jewish people. Okay. The government again started to exclude Jews from key positions. The attacks on Jews was part of the campaign against liberalism. In 1880 was a discussion of a motion to disenfranchise the Jews. So there was actually talking, even among some of the politicians in the Reichstag, that in 1880, that Jews should be defranchised from their liberty. Okay, but right after that, very early in the 1880s, the economy improved. And once the economy improved, the depression of the Jewish people dropped down. It passed down. And the anti-Semitic groups shrunk down again. So it seemed to be set on, and determined by where the finance was at, which was blamed, how much was blamed to the Jews or how much was not blamed to the Jews. Well, so there was a Social Democratic Party, and I don't know how many of you have heard of the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democratic Party began in the 1880s. It rose in the 1880s and became more powerful in the 1890s. That, by the way, was a very, very important party, especially in the 1920s, which we'll talk about actually in our next session, probably talk about in our next session. Okay, this gave the rise of the Social Democratic Party in the 1880s. This gave the Jews more confidence in gaining equality as the Social Democratic Party pushed for human rights in general. In 1893, the German Jews formed a political lobby fighting for their own civil rights, and their own political lobby organization was known as the Union of German Jewish Citizens of the Jewish Faith. Okay, of German citizens of the Jewish faith. In the 1890s into the early 20th century, there was also a small political party that actually we could make a parallel. The work that they tried to do is kind of parallel to the KKK and what they were in how they tried to, what they tried to do to the African Americans in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s down in the South. Okay, so the party that formed in the 1890s into the and ran into the early 20th century was actually a party that was called, and its actual name was anti-Semitic. And let's look for, and the anti-Semitic Party, this is from 1889. This is from 1889. They put out this caricature of Jews as an example of what they were trying to do and how they were trying to show Jews. A frustration for many Jews was the power of the monarchy running the government. The Reichstag was under the Kaiser's power. And what they believed, and of course, what they agreed with the Social Democratic Party and also a number of smaller parties that were pushing for a real democratic republic in Germany. What they all believed is that the Reichstag shouldn't just have to be approved by the Kaiser, by the Emperor of Germany, but actually had to be the place that actually made the laws that could be put out if they were passed and then signed by the Prime Minister. All right, is somebody asking a question? Oh, okay. Okay, so a frustration, like I said, of many of the Jews was the power of the monarchy running the government. Okay, the monarchy was just not what they saw as the best way to have government. They felt, like I said, along with a number of other politicians that were not Jewish, they felt that the Reichstag had to be the center of power. Okay, the Reichstag, like I said, was under the Kaiser's power. Now, at that point, going into the 1890s, 85% of German Jews supported the Social Democratic Party and even more liberal political parties. Imagine 85% of the entire Jewish population of Germany, of all the states in Germany, was in favor of those parties. That's really just very, very unusual that it would be that large of a percentage. You would think it might be unusual, except of course that the German Jews knew that they needed to be committed to the parties that wanted to set up civil rights for all the people. And why was that important? An example of how that became extremely important is that my great uncle, Richard Stern, who I wrote the book about, Uncle Richard became very active in the Social Democratic Party in the 1920s during the Weimar Republic. And we'll be talking more about that then. And he would teach his family about how civil rights are so important. Okay. And that's what he taught to my dad in the late 1920s, early 1930s, because he became, in 1926, he became my father's legal guardian, and he was raising him. He was raising him. So, okay. All right. This is this is going to be this is the last thing I'm going to say for right now, and then I'm going to open up for questions. Okay. This is Marcus Stern, Uncle Richard's father, and he was the grandson of Seligman Stern, and he was quite successful in businesses in the 1880s and 1890s in Weilerswist. And he was an example of how a lot of Jews in the 1880s and 1890s, especially in Prussia, but in Germany overall, started to have tremendous success. And I actually have all of his, I have all of the things that he worked on in Weilerswist, from my speaking or my researching in Weilerswist and speaking with the archivist of Weilerswist. And they're showing me all over, not only Weilerswist, but also Freisheim. And it was just so interesting to get his information of how successful he was, higher end, not rich, but higher end middle class, the higher up middle class, because he was able to build one of the first mansions ever built in the late 1890s in Weilerswist. Okay, just want to see where, yes. And here is the house that he built in the late 1890s. Imagine that being built. That was a mansion. And so you can see that it was called Villa Stern. And that was that's an example of what many German Jews were able to do as it got into the 1890s. Okay, so what I would like to do is ask if any of you have questions or things that you need to ask, or any thing you need to comment or
Yeah,
add into
I
this.
have a question, Rabbi.
Sure.
It seems, unless I'm misinterpreting it, that so much of the Jews' conditions are like based on one man who happens to be in power, at that time, you know, and who directs things, or is that just
Well,
incorrect?
you're actually bringing up exactly one of the reasons why so many Jews became so so much wanted, so supportive of the certain political parties, because they really wanted to get away from having a monarchy as the way for things to be decided. They felt that the Reichstag should be the place where things are decided, and that people's votes should be the thing that determines how things are done. And yes, you're right. There were some monarchs, especially Prussia, and because at this point the United States was only from 1871 on, and so yes, monarchies were not the things that Jews wanted. They wanted the opposite. Okay, so I see a question from FR, so go ahead.
Okay, so my question concerns, did you ever explore where exactly your family came from? Like, where were they in the 16th, 17th, 18th century before they washed up in Germany?
That's a great question. And I don't know where they were back into the 16th century. I only know, I can only assume that they were allowed in the places, certain places where I know that Seligman Stern and Nathan Romberg came from. They were born in their places that Jews were allowed in 1793. I don't know how far back they go, although from what my dad had told me is that from what he knew, that our family had been in Germany pretty much, in German states pretty much as long as we know that Germans were up there. And so in fact, yeah, go ahead.
So then they would have been there maybe during the time of the Crusades, like Rashi's time, etc.
Yes, it's a very good possibility that they moved in probably no later than the medieval times. That would be my guess.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you want to finish saying something?
No, I just want to repeat something that I said before, which is that I have their histories starting in 1793, because I have the proof that each of these that each of these family members, my ancestors, were born in 1793, which means we know where they lived at least in the 18th century and where their families lived in the 18th century.
Okay, thank you so much. This is very informative and it's very interesting. You did so much work on this. This is absolutely amazing. So thank you so much.
Well, and what I will say is, starting with next week's class, yes, I'm going to still give a lot of history, but I'm going to start to really put in a lot more about family, and because I have so much information about my family beginning in the beginning of the 20th century.
Wow. This has been absolutely wonderful. Rabbi Jack Romberg, thank you so much again for blessing us with such a fantastic presentation of all this knowledge and history. And friends, I hope that you will all tune in next week for our next installment. And I thank you all for coming to today's Lunch and Learn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We look forward to seeing everybody next week. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.